Here we are standing in front of a beautiful artifact, you could say. An aerobic windrow compost pile that we built about just shy of 72 hours ago. We make compost in a seriously aerobic fashion. Air, and principally the oxygen that's in the air, fuels the biology of the compost pile. And we make them in what's called a windrow. They're about 5-6 feet wide, X feet long, depending on how much material you have. In this case, it's 7 or 8 feet, and X high, maybe at least 3 feet up to 4 feet high. And there's a reason for this, the pile dimensions here. Bigger is better to a certain extent. But that would be mostly about the length, not so much the width and the height. The height is just, well, what's convenient. If you get a taller and taller pile, it becomes difficult to stack material on top. So 3-4 feet, something like that suffices. The width is actually kind of important. To maintain the oxygen content you need for the decomposition by microbes within the pile, you need a lot of oxygen. And so very rapidly within a pile, the oxygen will be depleted. You need to get oxygen back into the pile, and you can do this through a very passive process called diffusion. The more concentrated oxygen in the atmosphere can move into the pile, and the greater buildup of CO2 as a result of the microbial respiration can move out of the pile, so you recreate the equilibrium you need between oxygen and CO2 in the pile simply by constructing a pile that has good aeration, that is a mix of fine, moderate, and somewhat coarser material. But the other thing is that air doesn't move freely into a pile more than about 3-4 feet. So you wouldn't want your width to be more than about double that, 6 to 8 feet. So that's some of the reasoning behind both the height and the width of the pile. Indicators of success are, is there a temperature rise within 48, 72 hours after you construct the pile? Again, what works in your advantage is to have a good size pile, a good insular mass, as we do here. Probably above 3 by 3 by 3, but no sweat, no worries. You can build smaller compost piles. They just won't heat up as much, and they won't decompose as quickly, but they'll be fine in the end. Just take longer to get there like that. So we made this pile, and we recorded the temperature. We tend to track and create a little graph that has a heat curve, and the temperature at the outset is always ambient. If it was 65 out when you did it, that's what the temperature is. If it was 85, then that's what the temperature is. It was about low mid-60s here, and I have a compost thermometer here that I've taken samples of around the pile, and I'm getting readings, again, this is a little less than 72 hours in, of 115 to 123. Life is good for the microbes within. So the heat is basically an indicator that you have metabolically ignited the pile. Microbes are proliferating, again, exponentially, and it's just the result of it's a byproduct of their metabolism. If we were all to get in a telephone booth, you all remember telephone booths, no doubt, and just dance around, well, we generate heat. So it's an analogous thing, if you will, like that. And it means you're off and running. That's good. Typically, you would want this type of a heat curve. You start out ambient. I'm going to be a graph here. You start out ambient, you get a pretty steep rise in the vicinity of 115, 120, even 130 degrees, and then it flattens out for a period of time. How long? Well, it depends. Longer is better in that it means that there's still active decomposition going on. But at some point, the heat will taper off, the curve will start to go down. And this usually means one of two things. The material is digested, there's no need for such high microbial populations, so they subside. And that's partly true. But also, when the heat curve starts to decline, it usually means that oxygen is limiting. And so what you can do is turn the pile, re-oxygenate it, put it back together, and it's not uncommon to see another little heat surge like that because you've just provided oxygen to fuel microbial growth. And you could maybe do that a couple times like that. Turning is laborious. Turning has its downside in that the nitrogen that you put into the pile as decomposition proceeds will turn into ammonia gas. And as long as you keep that pile in good condition and intact, that ammonia gas will then be reconverted to a solid form, eventually nitrate, that plants can use. But when you turn a pile, it outgasses and you lose some of the nitrogen. So pros and cons like that. I'm going to probe into this pile a little bit and see what we see. Let me also refer to this tarp here. See the tarp? We have been covering this pile because it's fall and we're getting cool nights. We just want a little more of a heat boost. We were expecting and got a little rain. We were expecting some more to protect it, and too much water can cool off a pile, slow down decomposition. I have mixed feelings about covering a pile. In one sense, you want to keep it open for the aforementioned process of diffusion to be able to occur, excess CO2 exiting, oxygen in the atmosphere coming back in. That's good. But a tarp can sometimes be an aid against the elements. So that's what that's about. Let me just grab a fork here. Let's probe into the compost pile. I have a nice hay fork here. Should do the trick. And I'll say this, a good composter is curious, always investigating, looking. Okay, here's the theory. Here was our technique. How did we do? I don't know what I'm going to see when I dig into this pile, but very rapidly, again, we've been a little under 3 days here, probably within 5 to 7 days, what happens in a compost pile is you have waves of organisms that move in. The initial wave is primarily bacterial, and they are voracious consumers of that which is lush and green. So it's not uncommon 5, 7 days in, I put big leaves of comfrey or big leaves of broccoli, and where did that stuff go? It's rapidly decomposed. It's plant material, recognizable as plant material, but not as a broccoli, as a comfrey plant, etc. like that. That happens quickly. The easy to digest stuff is taken care of by bacteria in pretty short order, and then fungal organisms come in, and they're better at decomposing more carbonaceous material, that which contains chitin, lignin, cellulose, things like that, and takes a little longer. And then at the very end, as the pile cools off, you have a third set of organisms, actinomycetes, which are single cell like bacteria, but they have hyphae, sort of like root extenders like fungi, and they just flat out decompose pure carbon, finish the pile. Well, they don't quite finish the pile, because after these microorganisms have done the lion's share, as it were, of the digestion of the material, and the pile is cooled off, then you have macroorganisms coming in, millipedes, centipedes, sow bugs, earwigs, earthworms, and the like. And these are chewing and shredding species that literally break up the semi-decomposed organic material, further breaking it down, and also making it a softer, more exposed substrate to be populated by bacteria. So it's just waves and waves of organisms. Let's just take a look and see if we see anything significant. This might be a big dud, folks. Can you see that there's a little bit of outgassing going on here? I don't know if you can see it on camera, but there's a little bit of water vapor with CO2 in it, and that's just a result, yeah, maybe there. It's one of the reasons you want to make sure you put an adequate amount of water on a compost pile, because as this heat develops, you're going to evaporate the water and the pile could get too dry. The two most limiting things that will arrest decomposition are lack of air, lack of water. So make sure there's enough. I mean, if it's quote unquote dangerously dry, you would turn it and re-wet it. So in looking here, I don't actually see, we put on thick layers of green material, and even at a little less than 3 days in, in the immortal words of Marvin Gaye, what's going on? You know, you have a thick broccoli stalk here, but the leafy succulent green material has already been decomposed. So it's a rapid process. Again, microbes, they increase incrementally if the conditions are correct. And that's your job, is to set the stage for that biological activity. You're prepping some chicken on the cutting board in the kitchen. Chop it, chop, chop. Oops, the giants are on. I hear the crowd roar. I run in. Oh, I forgot to clean my cutting board. On that cutting board, bacterial populations double every 20 minutes. That's an exponential curve. Well, that can cause problems as far as food poisoning. But in the compost pile, that is a good thing. Chestnuts roasting on an open fire?
My hands are very cold.
Okay, if you stick your hand in there, they will be gently warm, Kelly. You good?
Oh, yeah. Stick my hand in the compost. Go ahead.
Yeah, there you go. I love it.
Whoa.
Okay, the laying on of hands. Here you go.
Wait, I want to touch it.
This is great. So, but this is good. This is what I said. You want to be curious. You want to investigate. You want to have questions. You want to check that out like that. So that is so sweet. So you see, we've generated heat. In the early days, in the 60s, we didn't have compost thermometers, but we learned that about 140 degrees is when you can't hold your hand in it. It's like, ouch, it hurts. So heat will be a function of the size of the pile and the material, again, the carbon-nitrogen ratio that you put in. Yeah.
A compost pile of this size, how long until it's ready to be used?
Oh, that's the classic answer to every question. It depends. And I'm not trying to be too much of a wise guy, but it does depend on the carbon nature. The higher the nitrogen ratio, the smaller the particle size, the quicker it will decompose. If you turn it, that will also speed up decomposition. But on average, you could look at having a nice crumbly product, almost that good, in 3 months, 6 months with a pile this size. There are methods. If you look up the UC rapid composting method, they have a bulletin online, and it's about taking a small 3x3 backyard pile and reducing particle size to 1 inch on it, chop, 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 and turning it every other day, and they can generate a finished compost in about 30-40 days. So, you know, it depends. My preference is to make a pile, leave it, make it right so it decomposes reasonably in 3 to 6 months, make another pile, make another pile, make another pile, going down the line like that. Let me just also add here that there are rules and regulations regarding food production, rightfully so, in the interest of public safety. There have been incidences of salmonella and E. coli poisoning in particularly leaf crops, but not exclusively so. And while the causative mechanism, as it were, hasn't been, despite much forensics, hadn't been totally identified in a lot of instances, there's concern about animal manures being a vector. So if you're using animal manures in a compost pile, you need to do the following. You need to have a pile that heats up to at least 131 degrees, maintains that temperature for at least 15 days, during which time you turn it 5 times. And this has been proven to be sufficient to reduce E. coli, salmonella, etc. Now that is nigh on impossible to do for an operation like us, or even a small scale farm. It's too time, labor, and machinery intensive. As a result, when I first started working with farming and gardening on the Central Coast here in California in the late 60s, quote unquote, no self-respecting farmer would buy commercial compost. They would make it themselves. Now here we are, and almost no farmer will make their own compost. They almost all buy it in, and it's simply because of needing to attain to these standards: temperature, time, turning, and what's practical or not for them to do. So they find it practical with all that they have doing to buy in certified compost. There are now businesses that have sprung up that's all they do. They make organically certified compost that passes the safety standards like that.